Our annual pilgrimage to Tasmania's Southwest National Park started, as usual, with a Friday night out in Hobart, followed by a 7:30 a.m. pickup by Tasmanian Wilderness Experiences. With breakfast in Huonville, it was 9:30 before we arrived at the track head in Ida Bay. Our average pack weight was 20 kilos, including 2 litres of water and 7 days' food, so an average base weight of 13 kilos. You can't go too light in this area, as you need to be prepared for winter weather, even in summer. Our driver gave us the cheerful information that only 65% of parties who attempt Precipitous Bluff by the inland route succeed in getting there, because they're walking into the prevailing winds, he said, a prescient remark. We were off at 10:20, and the first few hours were on a steep track through magnificent forest, ascending 650 vertical metres to reach the open moorland. The forest was full of lyrebirds, and we heard some spectacular concerts. The change when we reached the uplands was instant and dramatic. From enormous trees and barely a sight of the sky, to a desolate landscape of tussock grass and the grey skeletons of small trees lost in the bushfires a few years back. The track turned from leaves, moss and fallen timber to a narrow erosion ditch of mud braided into chaos where walkers have sought to avoid the deeper sloughs. The best advice is to recognise the inevitable and walk in the mud. Better for the landscape and much less exhausting. The tussock grassland continues past Bullfrog Tarns, where the frogs were calling loudly, and as we started to climb towards Hill 1, we hit the first band of Scoparia. Dracophyllum persistentifolium is a prickly shrub found only in Tasmania, and the dominant scrub in the southwest. Every bushwalker knows that scrub bashing is character building, but Scoparia is the very sandpaper of the soul. Its stems are strong and elastic, which is great when using them as hand and footholds on climbs, but when they're growing across the track, you need to shoulder charge to get through, especially if the track is steep and uphill. That gives the small branches a good chance to tear backpacks and inflict stick bites on any exposed flesh. And the leaves that densely cover every stem are sharp and prickly, the perfect character-building plant. Through this Scoparia belt, and getting closer to the 1,000-metre contour, we emerged onto real moorland, cushions of brilliant emerald green moss, expanses of flat rocks, and tiny alpine flowers everywhere. It's very beautiful and easy walking, but before we had the chance to really appreciate it, the wind hit us. The Southern Ranges route to Precipitous Bluff is a series of high ridges running roughly southwest. The prevailing northwest winds are confronted with the wall made by these ridges, which rise from the surrounding valleys often as much as 400 metres. As the moving air is forced up over the ridge, it can reach fantastic speeds. The underlying wind speed on this afternoon was probably around 30 kilometres, 10 metres per second, but on the ridge it was a matter of leaning into it to move and feeling it suck the heat out of you even through a good shell jacket. The next day we met a professional guide who'd abandoned his trip when his tent poles broke in the wind and was heading back to Ida Bay. After about 8 hours walking, we decided to stop at the next available campsite. There are a few places you can pitch a tent and find water along Moonlight Ridge, and the next one was the saddle between Hill 1 and Hill 2. We got there around 6 o'clock, feeling cold and battered. The sound of the wind on my hood was giving me a headache. The obvious place to camp is right in the saddle, where spare timber from previous track work has been laid out to lift tents out of the mud. But rather than pitch tents in the teeth of the wind, we dropped a few metres down on the lee side and behind some patches of Scoparia. It wasn't flat, but by putting my boots in the biggest hole under the tent, I managed to get my sleeping mat into a manageable Z shape. Head up, bum down, knees up, feet down. After a quick dinner, we crawled into our sleeping bags and waited for morning. Sunday morning dawned bright and clear, and with lighter winds. The Moonlight Ridge track mixes moorland with patches of scrub and expanses of open rock as it climbs over and around hills 2, 3 and 4. Jenny met her first snake of the trip, probably a white-lipped snake. Moonlight Ridge ends with a steady descent to Pigsty Ponds and Reservoir Lakes, the only truly sheltered campsites on this route. The misnamed Pigsty Ponds is a beautiful alpine meadow of soft green moss and wombat-cropped grass, surrounded on all sides by mountains. A tiny creek winds through the moss in a deep, narrow trench full of crystal-clear water connecting two small lakes. We set up our tents on perfectly flat, soft ground and lay around eating lunch and discussing what to do from here. Having failed to reach the ponds on day 1, it was unlikely we'd reach Precipitous Bluff, and when we got a weather update, it suggested steady rain from Wednesday. During the morning, we'd met a party on their way out who'd been camping at the ponds and climbing the nearby peaks. So we decided to change our plan and do the same, beginning with Mount La Perouse, which is an easy half day from the ponds. A couple of hours after lunch, we were on top of Mount La Perouse, 1,158 meters high and 350 meters above our campsite. It's an easy walk over rocky slopes. The top of the mountain is a plateau about 500 meters in diameter, made up of flat rocks like paving slabs. There's almost no vegetation. The view of the south coast and the surrounding peaks and glacial lakes are magnificent, and on a sunny afternoon with light winds it was a delightful place to be. At the center of the summit plateau is a 3-meter cube of carefully arranged rocks. This is a trigonometric station erected by surveyor James Sprent around 1850. As the peak is still 2 days' walk from a road, the idea of getting there in his day, presumably on horseback, carrying a giant theodolite and other surveying equipment before building this cairn, blows the mind. Sprent was the first European to spot and remark on Federation Peak, which we climbed last year, and we had wonderful blue distant views of Fed Peak and the rest of the Eastern Arthurs from most of the high points on this trip. As we made our way back down the mountain, we spotted a solo walker setting up camp at the ponds. Later, we discovered they'd been on a 9-day trip to the Bluff and the South Coast track, but the wind last night had snapped their tent poles at Ouse Lake, causing them to abandon the trip. This far south, sunset was not until nearly 9 in the evening, so we had a long, relaxed dinner lying on the soft moss and planning next day's walk. Towards dusk, wombats came out and grazed on the far side of the meadow. We awoke to a heavy fog. Our plan today was to climb Pindar's Peak, a pyramid of bare rock that we'd been observing from afar most of the previous day. At 1230 meters, it is the highest point on the whole route. Although it's a mere 6 kilometers map distance, we allowed 12 hours for the trip and were on the track by 7 o'clock. Jenny decided to stay in camp and spend the day exploring Reservoir Lakes. It felt like a day off for the rest of us too, because we only had to carry day packs. On the rocky slopes above the ponds is a 3-headed arrow of piled-up rocks, marking the split between the track to La Perouse and the track to Pindar's Peak and beyond. After about an hour, we were on top of Maxwell Ridge, a kilometre or so of bare rocky summit along which we made good time in the cold mist. That was useful, as the track down to Kingbilly Saddle is more representative of the southwest. It's a heavily eroded ditch through scoparia scrub on a steep slope, mostly a series of metre-deep erosion holes that you climb down using the scrub as handholds. By the time we reached the saddle, the fog was starting to break up, with patches of blue sky and occasional views of the surf on the south coast through windows in the mist. From the saddle, the track traverses through heavy scrub to reach Ouse Lake, which is actually a very pretty glacial hanging lake. It was mostly head-high scoparia, but with a nice break in the middle that we christened the Magic Pandanus Forest, where the tea tree gets high enough to suppress the scrub, and the dark interior is a jungle gym of pandanus stems as the plants grow long and thin to reach the light. Picking up water at Ouse Lake, we were only about 2 kilometres from the peak and started a steady climb up the slopes of Lake Mountain through open moorland. The wind picked up on the ridge between Lake Mountain and Pindars, and we were glad when the track dropped down on the leeward side of the ridge and worked its way around behind the peak. By the time we reached the saddle next to Pindars Peak, the sky had cleared to a glorious blue, the wind had dropped, and to cap it off, a wedge-tailed eagle was soaring around the summit. The peak itself is a chaos of large dolerite boulders, dappled grey and ochre. It was a fun scramble to the top, which we reached at 12 o'clock, 5 hours from camp. From here we had an extraordinary panorama of the south coast, with its long, surf-fringed beaches. Our route back over the ridges to the east, Mount Wiley and Precipitous Bluff away to the west, and to the north the Eastern Arthurs, with Federation Peak sticking up like a knife, and behind them the distant blue summits of the Western Arthurs that we climbed 2 years ago. Over lunch we discussed the remainder of the trip. It was clear from here how much remaining distance there was between us and Precipitous Bluff, and there's not supposed to be much of a track beyond this point, so clearly we'd not allowed enough days for the trip. Given the weather, we decided to finish a day early, and made use of the phone reception on the peak to call TWE and arrange an earlier pickup. We would have one more day to climb the Hippo and be in a campsite off the ridge by the time the rain hit on the following day. In the afternoon we retraced our steps, stopping for a swim in Ouse Lake and reaching camp at 6 o'clock. From the top of Maxwell Ridge we could see the tents and gave a mighty collective shout of "Make tea!" to Jenny, although it would be an hour before we were down there, so she wisely ignored us. We had a slower start this morning and started climbing back onto Moonlight Ridge at 9 o'clock. The wind was up again, but much less of an issue on our backs than when walking into it on day one. We stopped for morning tea just below the summit of Hill 3 and were struck again by the difference between the wild, windswept track and the sunny, sheltered slopes a few metres down the leeward side of the ridge. Here we dropped our big packs and set off with day packs to climb the Hippo, a spectacular rocky peak connected to Hill 3 by a long, bare ridge. The walk down the ridge was open and easy, but as we approached the Hippo, it became obvious how steep it is on this side, basically a wall of dolerite columns and scree. However, a Z-shape of scree and greenery running up the face seemed the obvious route, so when we reached the bottom, we started scrambling on the edge of a scree chute. As expected, this led to another chute, and a final chute ending between the twin peaks, the Hippo's ears. From this tiny saddle, it was an easy climb to the left-hand ear, the true summit, which we reached at 1 o'clock. So a pretty easy climb in the end, but enough to be interesting and give a sense of achievement. Once again we had magnificent views, this time of Mount La Pérouse, the Coxcomb, a series of massive dolerite pinnacles collected to that mountain, and the cascades of Arndell Falls, as well as the remainder of the Hippo stretching down towards the south coast. It was close to 4 before we were back over Hill 3 and on the track. On the rock platforms here I was struck by the horizontal trees, shrubs growing completely flat to the rock, with their trunk facing northwest into the wind, and the branches and leaves spreading out to the southwest, just like a two-dimensional picture of a tree. Other shrubs were growing on the southwest side of a rock, precisely trimmed to the profile of the sheltering rock as if the wind had cut them with a hedge trimmer. We had afternoon tea, with real hot tea this time as we were getting tired, at our old campsite between Hills 1 and 2, and then bashed through the scrub as we came down from the ridge to reach our next campsite in the headwaters of Mystery Creek at 7 o'clock. An 11-hour day. This must have been a magical campsite before the bushfires, a sheltered patch of forest around a stream. But after the big fires of 2019, it felt more like camping in a communication trench on the Western Front in 1917. Grey mud, surrounded by the grey, shattered remains of trees and the tussock and grey dead shrub stretching far away. The creek has much less capacity to retain water now, and although it had been running freely when we passed it on the way in 3 days without rain had reduced it to a series of unappetizing puddles. But we had a cheerful dinner before stowing everything away for the predicted rain. The rain arrived perfectly on schedule just after dawn and quite heavy. It was predicted to reduce by mid-morning and be reasonably dry, so we stayed in our tents until 10 o'clock before getting up for breakfast and packing in our wet weather gear. By the time we hit the edge of the forest, the sky was clearing, and we had lunch at the very pretty but waterless camping area just inside the forest boundary. After lunch, we had a lovely encounter with an echidna. From here it was a steep and pretty forest walk back to the track head, which we reached in time to explore the massive cave into which Mystery Creek disappears, and which is what brings most tourists to Ida Bay. On day 6, rain was predicted again for the afternoon, but the morning was only cold and overcast, so we spent it discussing lessons learnt, eating an oversized breakfast, and organising our gear ready for return to Hobart. Sure enough, just after Tasmanian Wilderness Experiences arrived to collect us, the skies opened and we drove back to Hobart in driving rain. While we didn't reach Precipitous Bluff, this was a great introduction to the Southern Ranges track. It is in many ways easier than either the Western Arthurs or Federation Peak, our previous 2 trips, as the track's better and there's much less climbing involved. But I've rarely felt so much at the mercy of the weather. The ridges would be quite dangerous in high wind and rain, and there are very few sheltered campsites. Nevertheless, we'll be back.